Good morning. And this is the story of Janice, the Pajama Fairy. And the story is written by a retired teacher from Amigo, Mr. Denonville, and illustrated by Ann Nada. And inside the cover, we see a dedication to a great school, Amigo Public School. And thank you for your support and kindness from Mr. Denonville, affectionately known as Mr. D. So our story begins, Dear Lola, this is the story of Janice the Pajama Fairy. Every Christmas Eve, if you have been a good girl or a good boy, you will find a lovely pair of nice, warm pajamas to wear for the winter. Once upon a time, there was a beautiful little fairy named Janice who lived in a far, far away land. And in that land, the weather was always warm, so all the little boy and girl fairies could buzz around all day and night in shorts and t-shirts. The warming rays of the sun meant that they never had to worry about being cold. Even at night, when the skies grew dark and the moon shone brightly, they never had to wear warm or cozy pajamas. One of the fairies, his name was Otis, was always cold, though. The other fairies could always hear him coming because his teeth chattered from being cold, and no one knew why he was cold. Some thought that perhaps he might have had a tough life and deep down was a very sad fairy. Even in school, he did not do very well. In fact, it took him longer to learn to fly than any of the other fairies in the land. Whatever the reason for Otis's sadness, over the years he became more and more of a loner. He lived by himself behind a big old rock away from the other fairies, shivering and lonely. As time went on, Otis hated the fact that he was always cold and the rest of the fairies were nice and warm. And maybe it was his heart that was becoming colder. Otis began to think of a way to get back at the other fairies, and he began to think of ways to make them as cold as he was. And one day, as he was flitting around the forest, shivering and by himself, he came across a big, thick blanket. An idea came to his mind. Maybe he could use the blanket to cover up the warm sun and make the rest of the fairies get cold too. Perhaps Otis could have used his brain to come up with a different idea for the blanket, but he didn't. So that is what Otis did. With every gram of energy he had, remember his wings were very tiny, Otis lifted the blanket high up into the sky and covered the warm sun. The land of the fairies was now in darkness, and the temperatures began to get colder and colder. Otis watched with glee from behind his big old rock as the other fairies in the land began to get colder too. Soon they were shivering and their teeth were chattering just like his were. All the fairies except one, Janice. Janice was a very special fairy amongst the rest of the fairies, always cheerful and friendly to everyone and even Otis. Janice buzzed around the community doing good deeds for one and for all. When she saw that the sun had been covered and the temperature was getting colder, she did not know what to do. All of her friends were becoming colder and sadder. As Janice was flying around one day by herself, trying to come up with an idea to warm everyone up, she happened to be by the big old rock that Otis was behind. She could hear Otis chattering to himself about what he had done with the blanket to make all the other fairies cold. Suddenly, Janice had an idea. Janice quickly flew home and got a big pair of scissors and took them to the edge of the forest where she found a corner of the blanket that Otis had used. She carefully cut out a square of the cloth and flew back to her house. Remember, Janice was very clever. Using the piece of cloth, Janice made a beautiful pair of pajamas, not for herself, but for Otis. Janice raced back to the big old rock as fast as her tiny wings could go and left those beautiful warm pajamas for Otis to find. When Otis got back to his rock after a day of admiring his not very nice deeds, he found the pair of pajamas that Janice had left for him. Why would someone do something nice for me when I have not been very nice to any of the other fairies? He wondered to himself. And as soon as Otis put on those pajamas, he could feel the warmth of the beautiful soft cloth. He began to warm up. His teeth stopped chattering for the first time in his life, and for the first time in his life, he began to feel happy. He began to care about the other fairies and wondered what he could do to fix the bad things he had done. From out behind the other side of the old rock, Janice flittered into view. She had seen how the pair of pajamas made Otis feel happy for the first time in his life, and she had an idea, but she needed Otis's help. Working together, Janice and Otis cut up that blanket that was covering the sun and worked together day and night for a week, making pajamas for every single fairy in the land. At the end of the last day, Janice, with Otis's help, went around to each house and left a pair of toasty warm pajamas for all the other fairies to wear. No one knew who brought those pajamas. Some fairies thought that it might have been Janice, and she became known as Janice the Pajama Fairy. But no one suspected that it would have been Otis too. And that was okay with Otis because he felt warmth in his heart with his good deeds. As soon as the other fairies put on their pajamas, they warmed up and became happy again. Janice and Otis were beaming with the happiness that they brought back to the land of the fairies. Now, we all know that pajamas do not last forever, and fairies do grow a little each year, so it has become tradition that Janice, Otis helps too, brings a new pair of jammies every year to all the fairies in the land. And now this tradition has become our tradition. So every year, when the weather grows colder, Janice and the Pajama Fairy will bring you a nice warm pair of pajamas. And she hopes that you too will pass these nice thoughts on, and one day you will also bring pajamas to someone who needs them. And the back page is always be kind from little Lola. And here's a picture of Grandpa Denonville and little Loa for Lola's Pajama Fairy Project.